welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one big idea or chapter today at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Ready to keep working our way through this meaty book of Romans?
Yeah, meaty
Yeah.
and mildly confusing, moderately, majorly.
Yeah. So we're going to be going through Romans chapter 4 today. It gets a little dense. It gets a little sticky. It's, once Paul starts getting, wandering around through some of his old favorite stories, and using them to make pastoral arguments, it feels often very much, I'll say, the fact that we are traveling through time, space, and cultures becomes just painfully evident. This is not a letter written to us to Gentiles 2,000 years ago. This is written to a blend of Jews and Gentiles in Rome 2,000 years ago. To add to that, Paul just has a very peculiar way of writing that it felt reading this like, you poor thing. Translating Paul.
It was something. Although this isn't where I got like stuck for a week. That was chapter 7. So.
Okay. So this is you by now, if you've been listening sequentially with us, you've already heard us announce that you can read Brandon's translation no longer as a Google Doc or as maybe we'll still have PDFs around, but now the place to find his translation is at litbible.net. It's the Liberation and Inclusion Translation of the New Testament.
LIT, yep.
Yeah, litbible.net. Yes, that's the site for thee. So I put my, okay. Segging back to Bible school.
T-B-I-B-L-E. Yes,
Yeah.
that's the book for thee.
I
put
my doubt in a lot of other words of God.
Lit by me. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where you can find it. So in this case, we're going to be litbible.net/Romans-4, the numeral 4. That's where you can find this to read along with us. So to recap, Romans has been, we don't think this is a book about, this is not a letter or a sermon or a piece of literature that is intended as an argument for how to go to heaven when you die or be saved from a wrathful God or avoid hell or anything like that. The center of what this is overcoming ethnic supremacism and how to have a deeper and bigger belonging across Jewish and Gentile lines through Jesus, the Jewish and risen Messiah. That is the story and the problem that he's trying to solve. So this is where he's starting to get into some weird arguments about Abraham and Torah and circumcision. If you're familiar with, I suppose if you've been anywhere near Protestantism, you have found that this is a place that Protestants love. Romans generally and Romans 4, because it's where we're starting to get more and more into this language of, in conventional translations, faith versus works. Or say we are saved not by our works. We don't earn our salvation. It is through faith alone that we are justified by grace. We are saved, all those things. And there's a certain loveliness to all of that. There really is. I would say, yeah, sure, to all that. It's true. Also, I would say, not what the hell he's talking about.
Right. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
certainly a gift, not something you're not earning belonging. You're not earning rewards. You're not earning anything. That's not the point.
yeah, yeah. So how would you summarize then what the faith we'll get into some of the word choices you're using, but for the sake of this, we'll just stick with the conventional language of faith and works. How would you
Yeah,
contrast
well,
what's going on?
it's a continuation of the conversation that's been happening since chapter one, weirdly, uh, of who gets to be included in the promise. Um, is it just Jews or is it other people too? That's the basic question, not do I, as an individual, how do I get to heaven when I die? Um, and so that's what it's talking about here is about being faithful by trusting the way of God, trusting God enough that following that way is worth doing, being faithful to it, to God, is worth doing, living that out with each other. It's worth doing, and that's being faithful versus do I have to do specific actions, check off the specific boxes to signal that I am part of the right in group, and then I belong,
Yeah,
but only and after I've done those check off the boxes. That's the distinctions that he's making. Is it A or is it B between those two things? Not
yeah.
do I get stamped that I'm going to heaven instead of hell
Hmm.
because I believe in God, that God exists and that Jesus is God, instead of following all the rules
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
because I can't.
yeah,
Right. That's a traditional kind of
yeah. You
dichotomy
don't
there.
have to culturally convert. You There
Mm-hmm.
is inevitably a sense of cultural deconversion from the learned patterns of domination and exclusion and fear and hate that is blended in with some good stuff in every culture.
Mm-hmm.
You will deconvert at some level. You will not feel quite as at home in your native culture, but you do not have to convert to um, becoming, in this case, he's making the argument specifically pastorally concerning the question of becoming Jewish. You
Right.
don't, and there, and you know, the marker um, for that is, according to the story, circumcision, male circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's spending a lot of time talking about that. And works language, or in your translation, actions, um, is substantially stand-in language for um, Torah things that we need to do to ethnically convert. And
Mm-hmm.
that can really to stay with Paul as making a pastoral argument. We can apply that pretty readily to, yeah, you don't need to um, speak English or be straight or like conform to certain gender roles or um,
Mm-hmm.
on down the line, even like the subculture of a particular church, um, you or denomination, you don't the terms of your belonging are not rooted in any of that. There's the secondary question of how people sort out that sort of stuff, but a lot of that stuff sometimes people will like tie into that, like they'll find scriptural justification or they'll try to
Mm-hmm.
for the conformity that they expect. But man, if anybody had the right to make that kind of a argument, it was the children of Israel. And Paul is saying, as one, no.
Mm-hmm.
And he lays out his argument for why.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
is not ashamed of it.
we love the sentiment, the Protestant sentiment of there's nothing you can do to earn your belonging in God's love. It is just not what's going on here. That's not what he's talking about. So let's get into that. Let's start
Yeah,
with the big word there.
yeah. Shall I bring it up on the screen?
Yes, please.
There we go.
Thank you. Um, where should we start reading from? I mean, I don't even know if we need to read the verse. I think just understanding the what's the word we're talking about here? Trusted faithfully.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we can read
Yeah,
the first few verses here. It's
do
in
it.
there.
Yeah.
So, so in that case, what will we assert Abraham, our ancestor based on family line, to have found? If Abraham was determined to be just because of actions, he has reason to brag, but not to God. What does the scripture say? Abraham was trustfully faithful to God, and it was counted as justness for him. So now payment for the one who works is not calculated based on generosity, but based on what is owed. For the one who doesn't work but is faithful toward the one who recognizes the disrespectful is just, their trustful faithfulness is calculated as justness. The very wordy and confusing word of the Lord.
Yeah. Thanks be to God.
That's not all Paul's fault. I'll figure out how to smooth that out a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
all my fault either.
No,
So,
no. It's a holy synergy of the two, like faith and works. Yeah. So,
mhm,
uh, where usually it's faith or belief or believe, um, you've got some variations, trustfully faithful.
mhm.
What,
Yeah,
what's wrong with
faithfulness,
faith?
trustful, um, because it has come to be used as eyes closed, pretending my cognitive dissonance doesn't exist, just accepting whatever is handed to me and parroting it back. Don't ask questions kind of belief. Um, Blind faith, you know. So,
Yeah.
and that's
Blind,
just
authoritarian,
really
and cognitive. Yeah.
right. Yep. Blind,
Disembodied.
authoritarian, and cognitive. Yeah. Yeah. Very intellectual assent,
Yeah.
but not really intellectual because you're not really thinking critically at all. Um, yeah. But we've talked about this more in other seasons too. But this is a good chapter to really spend some time on it in Romans, is that the word grouping there, pistis being the noun and pistio being the verb, is kind of this grouping of meanings that are surfaced a little differently in different contexts, but it's the sense of trusting and responding faithfully to that trust and kind of in a reciprocal relationship. So commitment is a good translation in some contexts
Mm-hmm.
too. It's that sense of I'm choosing to respond based on the trust that I have and be trustworthy, therefore. Um,
Yeah.
it's kind of all that grouping of meanings there. So sometimes I just do trust, sometimes I just do faithful or faithfulness. Um, and here I was trying out having both kind of muched together to try to highlight a little both of both the parts of that concept, that trustfully faithful. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, there's a sense of so Abraham was trustfully faithful to God. So Abraham trusted God and responded to that trust with faithfulness to God, with committing to living it in alignment with the way of living that God was showing him, calling him to, and then
Hmm.
committing into that based on the trust that, okay, I I maybe can't see all the outcomes of this yet, but I have enough sense of who you are, God, that I think this is the right way to go, and I'm going to commit to that.
Yeah. Yeah. It I think I would even contrast if we're going to come up with an alternative word for what that's being contrasted to here. Um, Honestly, obedience might be the word that it's contrasted with.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, it is not by obedience that you are found to belong, that you are saved, that you are liberated.
Mhm.
It is this messy, contentious, steadfast, stick with it, trustful faithfulness, because there is a personal dimension of like
Yeah.
how we face God, the divine creator, the kind of universe we find ourselves in that is different
Hmm.
from obedience. It is, and
Right.
specifically, I mean, I would say even like obedience to God, because there is a story here of
Hmm.
like the God character that this is cited amidst of all things the hardest one of the hardest stories in the Hebrew Bible, where
Yeah.
Abraham hears the God character say, take that kid that's bearing the promise. I need you to take him up the hill and sacrifice him to me. He's like, sure,
Yeah.
does that.
That's a really interesting kind of focal point is, yeah, I don't know that Genesis ever puts the story of Abraham through the lens of obedience and disobedience.
Hmm.
It's called to do things, encouraged to do things, and Abraham does them because he trusts.
He does them because he
But it's never about
trusts.
it's never framed as like a command and obedience to the command of your authoritarian ruler.
But the strange thing with that story though is he and this is following a number of like rabbinic reflections on it. So to continue the story, if you don't know, he takes his son Isaac up there and lays him on the pyre of wood and is about to cut him with a knife. And angel of the Lord is like, "Holy shit! Cut it out. Here, have an animal. Do that instead." And the and it was credited to him as righteousness. Uh, Rabbinic tales observe a few things, such as um, after that incident, his wife and his kid and God do not talk to him for the rest of his life as captured by the narrator.
There's no more dialogue between them. Yeah.
There's no more dialogue from Abraham between him and God, him and his wife, and him and his kid. So he
Hmm.
passed one test of like if you think God tells you to do something, do it. He passes like the obedience test, but he didn't.
Hmm.
I mean, the paradox of this interpretation I'm giving with how the verse is used, because
Yeah.
this is that he didn't actually trustfully, contentiously trust God and say, I don't think you're like that kind of God. I don't think you're the kind of God that wants human, let alone child sacrifice. He just says, okay, and like is about to go
Hmm.
kill his friggin' kid. So he passes the obedience, but he doesn't pass the fidelity test. And I recognize that is in
Yeah.
tension with what Paul is doing here, but that's the only way I can make
Well,
God not an
yeah,
asshole in that
that's not
story.
the only,
Yeah.
sure. That's not the only story about Abraham we have. There's lots of other stories. Some of them in which he's also not exemplary, with giving away his wife.
Yeah, yeah, he
Uh,
pimps his wife out twice.
yeah, which Dr. Gaffney believes that that's a repetition of one story,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, that's neither here nor there. So it seems like Paul has something else in mind, maybe a larger pattern of trustful faithfulness, or the
Hmm.
fact that he left his family from in Ur to go where God called him into the land of promise. Like maybe that's specifically what Paul has in view.
Yeah, he's
Um,
quoting from that particular story, but
right. So it seems like that's specifically what he has in mind, not necessarily everything that we have recorded that Abraham ever
yeah,
did.
yeah. So to bring it up to the present, yeah, the contrast does feel to me like trusting faithfully versus kind of a flat, uninterrogated obedience.
Hmm. Which, interestingly enough, not here, but next week in chapter 5, we get to where there is traditionally translated obedience and disobedience. And I did something different with each of those. So,
Oh, good, good, good. Um, yeah, so that's kind of the vibe of um the faith versus works angle. I think it's worth acknowledging also that let's just get my printed copy of this out. Um, in verse 20, so Romans
yeah, scroll
4:20.
on down.
Um, yeah, thank you for scrolling. He did not mistrustfully dispute the promise of God. Instead, he was reinforced regarding trust and gave praise to God. Mistrustfully dispute. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, like that to me, that's just an excuse to talk about another word that you're not going to play around, that you're not going to let into this thing, which is doubt. That's one of the common
Yeah,
ways it's
yeah.
translated.
Right. Yeah. In other places, it's doubt. I think most of the traditional translations do waver here.
Hmm.
Um, and that one's not terrible. What both of those words imply to me is a questioning, what uncertainty, and wrestling with ideas. And weirdly, while authoritarian versions of Christianity have really, 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 really discouraged any kind of critical thinking and questioning, wrestling with hard questions, Bible really actually encourages it. And in fact, the whole nation of Israel is named after Jacob when he wrestled with the angel. Like it's inherently a people who wrestle
Yeah.
with hard things, right?
Yeah, and the belonging
Um,
and the identity is found in the wrestling more than in the like consent.
right. And so what's interesting, the contrast there between like waver and doubt and these things that are
Should
about
change that word from
questioning
consent.
and
I'm sorry, that has a problem.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I just realized that was a
Yeah,
catastrophic word
what's the
choice.
alternative? Catastrophic. That's a good, yeah. So not consent, but acquiescence, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but here, what the Greek word is, it's diakrone. It's really about making a judgment through between something. And so often it's like kind of this discernment idea of trying to figure out between two things. Um, when it is used with a more where the scripture is like not so happy with it because it's not always a bad thing, but is when it's about like a certainty of like I'm right and you're wrong and I want to separate from you because of that.
Oh yeah.
That's really the word there. And so it's not about uncertainty, that is the problem. It's actually the certainty about a judgment against.
Hmm.
Um, so that's what it's trying to get here is
Yeah.
that's the dispute word here. And
Mm-hmm.
trustfully is a separate word. It's like opposite of the trustfully word.
Yeah. Because
Um,
if we're gonna detangle faith and works to be actually about trusting faithfulness and um, exclusionary obedience, um,
mhm,
then we all the other word in we're all part of this work is trying to recover from both authoritarian and cringy articulations of
mhm,
Christianity.
mhm,
And so we also got to do the work of like, well, faith is contrasted with earning your salvation and with doubting God and with doubting his word and
right,
doubting his
right,
promises. And it's usually a way to shut up intellectual and heartfelt questions and
right.
say, oh, you have weak faith if you question this settled, strong, probably abusive understanding of God.
Hmm. Yeah. But what it's questioning here
Yeah.
is disputing the promise of God. Now, I probably should go back and capitalize that because this is not just
Oh.
any promise of God. It's specifically the promise to Abraham. The
Mhm.
all people groups will be praised as worthy through you. It doesn't quote it here like it does in Galatians, but in Galatians 3, Paul makes it really clear that's what he's talking about. In fact, even defining the gospel, the triumphant message, as that quotation.
No kidding.
Um, yeah, that's in chapter Galatians 3.
Whoa. Okay.
Um, so he's dancing around that here. This whole chapter 4 of Romans is talking about that story, that Galatians 15, a lot of
Yeah.
quotations of Galatians 15 here. Um, and it's referencing it here with the promise of God and being fully convinced that what God promised, God is able to do. Um, that's what we're talking about with what God promised.
Yeah.
Um, but there are people who Paul is addressing
Hmm.
that are unfaithful and are judging that promise as you don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah.
And that's where you come back to chapter 1, where Paul says, I am not ashamed of the triumphant message of the promise to Abraham that all people groups will be praised as worthy.
Hmm.
I'm going to keep saying it, and there's no way you can't tell me I'm betraying Israel. You can't tell me I'm betraying the church because that is the whole foundation of this thing.
Bingo. I think that is the linchpin of the argument he's making is like,
Hmm.
okay, his um antagonists, his opponents in argument and in basically how to be the church and knowing who's in and what role does ethnic conformity play in this. They're appealing with serious warrant to the Torah, to these stories of like, the badge of belonging, the way that we know that you're in, that you are part of this group is that the males undergo ritual circumcision. Uh,
Hmm.
and he's saying, well, no, you got to go back to Abraham. And they say, aha, there's a point in the Abraham story where he gets his and all of his clan gets the circumcision done. He's saying, well, keep going further back, actually.
Hmm.
Um, like the Torah and circumcision are in service to the promise.
Hmm.
I heard another rabbi say, um, humanity is not made for the Sabbath. but the Sabbath is made for humanity. And I think in the
Mm.
same way, the promise is not made for Torah. Torah is made for in service of this promise of all of humanity being found to be heirs and participants in this promise, found to be praiseworthy. Um,
Mhm.
and he's basically just saying, read the story in the right blip in order. like,
Right. Yeah.
like the Torah is here because to be a life vessel, a lifeboat to carry the promise forward and have a playground of fidelity together of a particular ethnic people, but it's always pointed beyond itself. It's and he does all kinds of other ways of pointing out how their sacred stories and texts points to the Gentiles will all come and belong. But he hardly ever
Mhm.
points to those stories where, when Israel is established and Zion, comes back down on Zion and Zion is raised up above all mountains, and that is the triumph of their God, and all of the Gentiles and their treasures will come flocking to Zion. He doesn't even touch those citations. In part, I would
Not until
wage.
chapter 15, anyway.
Really? Does he bring it in there? Oh, because he's appealing for economic
Yeah, as
support
he's
for.
wrap yeah,
Yeah,
as he's wrapping things up before he does the greetings and stuff, he quotes like three or four back-to-back Hebrew Bible quotations about the Gentiles being included.
yeah, yeah, and it's in service to like bring like in Galatians, the Jerusalem church is poor. They need some money. You kind of owe it
Hmm.
to them because it's their story you're being folded into. Um,
Yep.
but all of his densest argumentation is not based on that sort of ethnocentric way of being folded in or coming to submit
Mhm.
to Yahweh in Zion. He's doing it by going to the beginning of the story.
Right. Right.
And that's where trusting faithfulness lives. And that's where you're grafted into. Well, that's the template from which it is Jesus's trusting faithfulness that we are folded into.
Mm.
Because he was crucified as a
Yeah.
disobedient one.
Disobedient to whom?
Yeah. Yeah. He was faithful to Torah, but was he obedient to some people's carrying of Torah,
Yep.
eating food on eating harvesting grain on the Sabbath and all that.
Right.
Touching lepers.
Yeah, and you mentioned that like the idea of like Torah being made for the promise, not the other way around. And coming back to the unnamed rabbi that talked about Sabbaths being made for humanity, uh that's really fits into the argument of Romans too. Romans 1, once he starts, he's already once he establishes the kind of foundational, this is about the promise, folks, uh, and then starts building out the argument. The reason he says that idol worship is a problem is because it's putting humans as worth less even than objects. Not even just objectifying them, but as worth less than them, that they are used as things to honor objects.
Oh man.
And that's the problem with idolatry.
Yeah.
That's the argument in chapter 1. And so it's very similar here. It's like people first, people are what matter,
Yeah.
being having all peoples praised as worthy instead of as only as instrumental for honoring objects.
Yeah.
That that's the promise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's making a very elaborate um set of arguments because he's just trying to like detangle from a variety of sources kind of all at once and pull
Yeah,
them all
just trying to
back.
deconstruct like 8 different arguments. and
Yeah.
pull it all into the promise to Abraham.
Yeah. God bless you, St. Paul. That was bold. It was bold. Um, I'm trying to see if there's any other big translation changes to acknowledge. I guess at the cringe level, this is a cringe. It's cringe, but it has consequence.
We're being
Um,
cringe mindful. Yeah.
hashtag blessed. So the word blessed
Oh yeah.
is a word that we don't really see. Do we ever see it in the liberation and the inclusion
No, I never
translation? No.
use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Partly because of the cringe, the hashtag blessed kind of thing and bless your heart kind of stuff,
Hmm.
but partly because there are actually two unrelated Greek words that both get translated into English as blessed,
Oh, I didn't know
and then
that.
you don't if you're translating them both as blessed, then you don't know what it's actually talking about.
Yeah.
So there's the one that's here that I'm translating as gratified or gratification. And then there's the other one that's eulogeto. It's where we get the English word eulogy. It's that phrasing as worthy, speaking well of, benediction
Mm.
um, piece. And so, like, blessed in Matthew 5 in the Beatitudes is the one that ends up being gratified here. Uh, Speaking a blessing over someone like Jacob did with his sons in Genesis, that's the other one.
Yeah.
And they're in the Greek, they're not even related at all.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
The
you've got
promise
yeah.
actually uses the benediction one. The praised as worthy is how I'm translating that in that
Okay.
verse. Um, but that doesn't actually get quoted in this chapter. So.
No, yeah, you're going in the direction of being gratified are those who do these things or speak about the
Mhm,
gratification of the person. In your footnote, I from verse
mhm.
7, you say
Yeah, let me
gratified
scroll
here can
back
be,
up.
yeah,
Ooh, we can even demonstrate the linking of the footnotes. So here's verse 7.
yeah,
Gratified are those whose Torahless actions are dismissed and whose deviations are covered over. Let me click on footnote I, and boom,
boop, boop.
right here. Traditionally blessed. The word carries both a sense of receiving a gift or benefit and a sense of the satisfaction and gratitude experienced in response to receiving it. So,
You're giving that give you reason to feel
mhm.
satisfied.
Hashtag
Uh,
blessed.
yeah,
Yeah.
the
And
translator
I'll
worked his
click
ass
back up
off
to the
to
top.
develop this and get use AI to get the coding to play nice and then manually coding every single one of those. Um, it
Yeah,
was a
it's been
lot.
very time consuming.
Was a lot.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that gratified here can be defined as given reason to feel grateful. I love that you included that. It's such a gratified and gratification is such a just word that isn't I don't use.
It's not used that
But
often. Yeah.
it that trend the explanation of the word I realize is actually how I've been trying to use what the sense I've been making when I see the word blessed because blessed is yeah it's religious gobbledygook. It is used by the prosperity gospel people. It's a way to justify privilege and exploitation as God's blessing, as God's favor. And so, yeah, really, the word favor, it's used as synonymous with God's, I suppose, exclusionary or hierarchical favor. It's a way of spiritually bypassing domination and privilege,
Mhm.
which is a crisis.
Yes.
That is the
Yeah.
collapse of a tradition on itself there.
Mhm.
Like, given here, like, yeah, it's meant to be conveying a sense of interior gratitude And particularly as you said before we were on air, a controlling hunch of yours is that when you do see that word in the Greek, always be curious if it's referring back to Matthew 25 and Deuteronomy 30:31.
Five.
Five, thank you. Thank you. Not
Yeah.
the sheep and goats one.
Yeah. And
Uh
Deuteronomy 28 to 30. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, thank you. Um where it's spelling out like this is the fulfillment of the promise. It's got a fundamental, to use the Bible, to use the theology word, eschatological, um,
Hmm.
which is another way of saying pertaining to the arrival of the promise. Like it usually just means
Right. Yeah. An eye to where
end
things are
things.
going.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. An eye to where things are going is broadly what it means. Within the story of Israel, eschatological means with an eye to the promise.
Hmm. Hmm.
And a way that that might be popping into this moment. Um, so gratified are those, or like speaking about gratification, if it means given reason to feel grateful instead of given a supremacist and exclusionary favor, well, that feels way better because every instance of liberation, of vindication, of homecoming, belonging, forgiveness, and rest. These are all words that are used in the sacred story to
Yeah.
describe
Yeah.
the promise happening. And they all are um, meant to provoke gratitude as something that you received, not earned, and
Hmm.
happened in spite of perhaps your supremacism or racism or fill in the blank, your deviations. So you get the
Yeah.
payload of um, being blessed through by grace through faith and all that stuff, but it's
Yeah.
fundamentally part of the story.
And at its essential level, this is not about individuals. So,
Oh,
like, even Deuteronomy 28 to 30, it's about the entire community being either receiving these good outcomes based on living faithfully or receiving the natural consequences of living unfaithfully.
yeah,
Um, and in the context of Romans, it's back to that, like, who belongs? Is it just Jews or is it everybody else too? And I am insisting, I'm not ashamed to keep insisting that the promise of Abraham that everyone is praised as worthy of these things, that is point. And so
yeah,
it's that sense of groups, whole communities of people, not at the individual level of like, do I get dismissed as an individual so I get to go to heaven when I die instead of hell? That is not the question. And I don't know how many times I need to say that,
yeah,
but that's never the question the Bible is trying to answer.
yeah, yeah. I sometimes feel crazy how often we repeat ourselves episode by episode, but it's part of the work of retraining our eyes and ears to hear these sacred, wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
fascinating, enraging, comforting texts,
Yeah.
is to hear it in the right story and exercising that demon of authoritarian
Mm-hmm.
carceral torture aversion
Yeah.
takes work.
And can I point out that as I'm like ranting and raging about it being about the community level, not the individual level, my eyes rest on the word individual in my own translation right here.
Mm,
Uh,
footnote J is going to be load bearing.
yeah. So it's not that it doesn't, like, individuals are real, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can't have a community without individuals. So it applies on all levels. Uh, and
Mm,
it's still not explicitly about, did I pray enough times? Did I go to church on Sundays? These things that are fundamentally about me as an individual. Did I say the sinner's prayer or not? Right? It's about how do I, as an individual, live within the community? Love your neighbor as yourself. I give you a new commandment, love one another. It's even when it's talking about individuals, it's always talking about how I, as an individual, interact with the community.
Mm-hmm. And that is a trusting faithfulness that goes back to the promise and the crucified one as well. So I think that's where we got to wrap this one up. Thank you so much for your company on this leg of the journey. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or a review on whatever app or player or website you are using to enjoy this on, whether that's YouTube or Apple Podcasts. Those ones really helps if you feed the algorithms a little bit. It makes it easier for more people to find this show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. The website, the web home of Romans is in the episode notes. I'll just tell you now, it's lit, litbible.net, litbible.net. And you can follow, so you can read it there. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Threads as @OldSongNewDance and read more of his work at oldsongnewdance.com, which is also linked at litbible.net. You can follow me on Threads as @BDRhodes. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya land. Bye, Brandon.
Hi, Brandon.
Bye, everybody.